Okay, hello, welcome everybody to this best practice forum. We will be getting started in just 1 minute as we let people sort of file in here. And I think we can go ahead and get started. So welcome to our March Best Practice Forum, the intersection of E&C and ESG, what you need to know. We will just go ahead and get started with introducing our panelists. Colin, we can start with you, and we'll just do a quick round of introductions here.
Thanks, Brad. My name is Colin Etmeyer. I am the head of ESG for BC Partners, which is a private equity firm that's based in the UK, but we invest in both Europe and North America. I have about $45 billion under management. Before that, I'd also been working in the private equity space in ESG with the Carlyle Group. I should turn it over to Karen because Karen works at Navex Global, one of our portfolio companies.
Great, thank you, Colin. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Elenardo. I'm the VP of ESG Solutions at Navex Global. I was the founder and CEO of CSRware, which stood for Corporate Social Responsibility Software, back in 2006 during my environmental management master's program. And I've been focused on CSR, sustainability, and ESG for many, many years now. And the goal really is to, has always been to work with a lot of early adopters and companies to integrate all this expertise into a software solution. So it's great to be here today, and I look forward to the panel.
So I think by the silence, everyone's introduced themselves except for me. So I'm Bob Mascola. I'm the host for the session that had the privilege of being booted out at our start time of 2 p.m., but now I'm back in. I'm the Senior Director of the Compliance Programs at Fordham Law School. It's a graduate degree programs that we offer in corporate compliance. And I am very pleased to be back in and to welcome everyone to this best practice forum with all of our panelists. I just want to make sure before I start with some introductory remarks that all of the panelists had an opportunity to introduce themselves.
We still have Alex and me, so
go ahead then.
Do you want to go ahead, Alex?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Alex Kesalika. I'm a Risk Compliance and Assurance Director at BT here in London, and I'm the representative of the working group on this panel. Nikolai, over to you.
Thanks. I'm Nikolai Lundy. I'm Director of Partnerships and Market Outreach at SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, for those who don't know. So we work with companies and investors to identify how sustainability issues might have a material financial impact industry by industry. And in my role, I work with primarily asset managers, asset owners, service providers with data, analytics, corporate reporting, and trying to support the ecosystem for the use of ESG information. So that's me and my role.
All right, thank you. Before we get underway, I wanted to make a few administrative announcements, and then we'll get to what I'm sure will be an excellent discussion. We will be taking your questions throughout the session. Please don't hesitate to use the polling tabs. So on your Pathable screen, what you should see is a series of tabs and a box on the right side of your screen that says chat, polls, file, and people. I prefer you didn't use the chat feature, which might seem to be the intuitive one to use for asking questions. But if you go under polls, even though we're not running any form of polls, that's where you will find the place to ask a question that will be visible to all the panelists. We do have planned to leave some time at the end, but where it makes sense, we may take your questions on the fly. And if you use that feature, we'll all be seeing it. So please do that. The materials for this webinar are available in the resources tab. So feel free to browse and click on and download any of the materials that you want, including the white paper that we're pleased to make available today. And also, please do not hesitate to visit our sponsors' booths during this session, and you can find them also on your Pathable page. and we have our Karen Alenardo from NAVEX is the key sponsor for this event, and so we're happy to have NAVEX represented. But with that, why don't we get started? And Alex, I'm going to start with you because you were involved in ECI's working group, which really is writing about the exact topic of this webinar, the intersection between ethics compliance and ESG. Can you just give us a little bit of background on how this working group was formed and a little bit about the white paper, the background of the white paper that is being published today?
Sure, thanks, Bob. And again, good evening and good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, as Bob said, the focus of the working group was to set out the role that the E&C community can have in the ESG activities within their organizations. And I believe we first got together in about August of last year, and pretty much worked up through the holidays and just after January is when we pulled this white paper together. We had about 15 members of the working group, both from corporates and advisory firms in the US and Europe. And those that were representing corporates, we had some that were just at the beginning of their ESG journey in their companies, and those that actually had quite established programs. So really a good spectrum of views to feed into this white paper. I do actually think it's quite timely, given the the ever increasing focus of ESG that we're seeing these days. There's that funny meme going around of the fastest things on Earth. The first is a cheetah, then an airplane, then the speed of light, and then the fastest being people becoming specialists in ESG. So hats off to whoever came up with that one. But joking aside, just in my experience, this very much is a topic that is now front and center of investors' minds. The amount of questions that companies are receiving from their from analysts, from investors going into the investor relations departments or on road shows with the executives is only ramping up, and really it's to a point now where this is a topic that is being discussed regularly within C-suites, at least in my experience. Also, current events, I think, have played into this in terms of why this is actually coming to the fore. With COVID, if we look through that lens, we've got issues such as supply chain management and workforce well-being. You also have the various social movements, be it Black Lives Matter, Me Too, that are bringing topics like diversity and inclusion to center stage. And there's also human rights issues, for example, in Europe that are now really getting a lot of attention. So all with that, we felt from a working group perspective, it's really important for those that are dealing with ESG, in particular the E&C professionals, to be familiar with the landscape that's out there, both from a reporting and a ratings perspective. Just on the reporting side, for most part, as we say in the paper, it's been voluntary in nature to date. However, that is starting to change. In particular, in Europe, there are now some regulatory requirements with regards to reporting certain non-financial information disclosures. A lot of that, again, though, still sustainability and environmental focused. But for the E&C professionals, topics such as anti-bribery and corruption, ethical behavior, whistleblowing, supply chain management, human trafficking, these are all now becoming topics that are also starting to feature in the reporting requirements that companies are having to face. On the rating side of things, again, as we set out in the working paper or the white paper, there are dozens out there, and it's really important that companies are aware of those various rating agencies and how they're being looked at. And again, we'll come on to this later, I'm sure, but the importance of understanding what is important from their organization, their stakeholders, so that when they are looking at how they're being scored and the lens they're being viewed through, that they're focusing on the right ones with the limited resources that they have. So I guess that's just a bit of color, Bob, on the working group and the paper that we produced. And I know we'll go into a number of these topics in more detail as we go through the session.
All right, great. Thanks, Alex. Nicola, I'd like to go to you next. You're with SASB, and I think a lot of the audience is some familiar with your organization, but it would be helpful if you could just describe briefly what SASB is, how it was formed, and what its objective is.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bob. And maybe I'll start with that last point. What's the objective? So if we take a step back, for about 100 years, one of the cornerstones of capital markets has been public disclosures to help investors make more informed decisions. That's why we have standardized financial accounting, whether it's FASB in the US or IFRS standards globally. But what we've seen is that the financial statements aren't fully capturing corporate value right now. And I'm not just talking about the market cap of Tesla or compared to its balance sheet and cash flow. I'm talking about a long-term trend for 50 years now that there's been a shift in the value of intangible assets comprising a percent of enterprise value for companies. And so there's information not currently captured that is useful to understanding enterprise value. And so SASB is trying to help shine a light on that kind of current set of information that falls outside of the financial statements. You know, there's no mistaking the fact that SASB sounds a lot like FASB and ISB. You know, we use the same model for setting standards that the financial accounting standards do. But what we do is we identify what are the sustainability topics that can have a material financial impact on companies within industry, and what are the accounting metrics to measure performance on those topics. So we get feedback from companies and investors. We publish standards, and those standards are meant to guide disclosure. Right now, it's pretty much all voluntary. You know, over time, I think we're going to see most, if not all, jurisdictions probably move to more mandatory disclosure. The details to be worked out. But SASB's role is to really provide guidance for disclosure of information around what sustainability topics might provide insight into enterprise value. And so as a standard setter, we are not a ratings firm. You know, Alex pointed to that dynamic in the landscape. We don't decide what is good or bad. We don't say what companies should or shouldn't do. That's for the market to decide. Our focus is improving the availability and comparability of a limited set of metrics that can provide insight into corporate value around sustainability. So that's a little bit more about who we are, what we're trying to achieve, and how it fits into broader corporate disclosure.
All right, thank you, Nikolai. Colin, I'd like to go to you next. You know, you're in the business of evaluating companies from an ESG perspective as a private equity investor. And perhaps SASB is a framework that you use, but it would be helpful if you could describe the process that you go through in evaluating companies that you might be investing in from an ESG perspective.
Absolutely. And speaking after Nikolai is perfect, because undergirding all of this for investors is, you know, certainly we at BC believe that ESG factors, when material to a business, and that's an important filter, do genuinely drive financial outcomes for us, both in the selection of investments that we're making, and then also how we manage them once we're in ownership. I should say, just very briefly at the top, our asset class is a bit different than other types of investment, and that means that in some ways the details will look a little bit different, but in general, the principles are the same. But in private equity, we first of all mostly take majority controlling stakes. We want to take over a company in order to change its management. We're primarily bidding for private companies. And because of those first two factors, number three is we typically do fewer deals than, you know, a stockbroker who's trading at a desk. So that means our process looks a little bit different. For us, it starts obviously when we're deciding where to allocate our money, which companies to bid on. And that's a diligence process that for us, we engage outside experts, law firms, you know, tax and compliance people, HR, sometimes depending on the nature of the business. Certainly it can be an environmental or social specialist if we identify those issues of material. So we engage all these experts, these third parties. I help run the diligence on our end from an ESG perspective, and we try to get an idea of, are there risks or opportunities in this business that are potentially material to the transaction? either in the price that we pay, how we manage it, what the exit might look like in several years down the road. For example, if you buy a coal asset nowadays, you can't expect to be selling it 5 or 10 years down the road. So these are all things that we kind of give that information to the deal teams, and then the deal teams can, it can help inform their decision making. But we really have a business focused case for it. We really do think it enhances returns. We also, I should probably note, our underlying investors, the people whose money we manage, do frequently have preferences about the places that they put their money, and they want to know that somebody is looking after those exact issues. So it's kind of these two factors are pulling. We really do believe it as a financial return, but there is a certain element of which we need to be consistent with their values. And then in ownership, for our asset class, we're typically taking controlling stakes or large minority stakes, typically with a partner where, effectively we're doing a lot of the management of the business. And we take those material issues and we try to drive value creation on those levers. And that's, kind of the benefit that we have that perhaps public markets people don't. But ultimately speaking, one of the things that's helpful for identifying those material issues is having a consistent framework. None of the companies that we're looking at, since they're in the private markets, have a full suite of well-audited data to turn over to us on all these financial factors. That's just because we're not mature enough as a space right now. But I think in the long run, that's where it's headed, and it's headed through frameworks exactly like SASB. So we don't use SASB the way that perhaps a public trader would, but we actually do use SASB in terms of identifying what are material issues for a given sector and just making sure that we kind of have good visibility over them. And so, we're ideally all the asset classes are going to have that sort of process. It's just going to look a little bit different depending on where you sit.
And before I go on to Karen, can you just describe a bit of, has the process that you described evolved significantly over the past 5 years?
Yeah.
Or has this been, I mean, ESG is a new term for a lot of people, but for many people it's been around, and we'll get to that when we get to Karen. But I'm just curious whether your process that you just described has evolved over the past 5 years, and if so, if you could describe that.
I would say the general structure of the process isn't necessarily distinct. Certainly it's not rocket science. It fits within the traditional PE model. But what's different is the level of information that we get from companies, how it's structured, and it's certainly in ownership, what they're intending on doing. So when we're exiting our companies, when we're selling them off, one of the common exit pathways is into the public markets, and the expectations of the public markets are far higher and far more standardized than they were 5 years ago. So nowadays, all of our companies are kind of, or many of our larger assets are preparing themselves as if they're about to hit the public markets, and they're doing GRI reporting or SASB and whatever it may be. So I'd say that the general structure of the process, not dissimilar, but nowadays it's more structured for sure. And as was alluded to earlier, there are actually regulatory requirements in a lot of places, be it TCFD is now, I think, legally required of UK public entities. EU has a sustainable finance directive, and we only expect that to continue. So I'd say that, like, in principle, the same. The particulars, though, definitely getting more rigorous.
Okay, thank you. Karen, I'd like to go to you. You've been in this space for a while. You started up, as you described at the outset, your own firm, created CSRware back in 2006, which, is some time ago, but in the ESG world is like a different era. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what was the need that you saw that you were trying to fill then, and then a little bit about what the need is today that you through now Navex, which acquired your company, what is the business need you're trying to fill now?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, it has been since 2006. I am aging myself, and sometimes I even talk about the dot-com boom, so I've got to be careful. Anyway, well, I'll tell you, I did grow up in kind of the Silicon Valley world, right? So, many years of just software, being involved in software companies in Silicon Valley. Really great innovative companies, Electronic Arts, Critical Path. We did some really great advanced type of technological solutions, right? So in being part of that, I really started seeing, we all started seeing a lot of different dependencies on energy, for example. Back in the day, right, we had a lot of brownouts and blackouts in our data centers. And as a hosted email company that needed 24/7 email up and running, losing energy was a pretty big deal, right? So we started, it started planting the seed for me, like, oh my God, these businesses, we're really dependent on natural resources, energy, water, all these different resources. And so it started planting the seed. I also cared about habitat, what's going on with companies and they're sprawling out in all these different areas, not considering, habitats for, wildlife and our ecosystems and our food chain. And so all these things just kind of resonated with me. And so I went back to school, got my master's degree in environmental management, and that was around 2005. So around 2006, it kind of hit me that we have really great, smart environmental scientist people doing a lot of incredible work, and they're exposing a lot of things that we all need to pay attention to. But when I was in corporate America, I didn't understand them. They were speaking a different language to me. So there was no way I was going to be able to understand that they're telling me there could be potential impact of how your business is, whatever, running data centers or how it's performing their businesses across the supply chain, et cetera. All these different issues were starting to pile up. So in school, I started learning about corporate social responsibility. So CSR became CSRware, corporate social responsibility software, because it became really evident that there were no analytical tools to bridge the gap between environmental management and environmental science with corporate America or just corporations in general. So, I just kind of, put on my little software hat, started thinking through it a little bit, and thinking about how do we develop a software solution that addresses people, planet, and profit, right? Because that's really what we needed to think about. And all of a sudden, this clean tech wave happened, right? Everybody probably remembers clean tech back in 07, 08, where we were all talking about, investors at the time, Colin, were talking about solar investments and, big investments in clean tech. We weren't focused on software and efficiencies at that time. So a lot of the investments didn't go into software solutions per se, but a lot of companies were starting to figure out that they needed to do something around environmental management, right? We didn't call it anything other than CSR and clean tech and green back then. So just in talking with companies, going to a lot of clean tech events, working with early adopters like Salesforce, Electronic Arts, Juniper Networks, Kohl's department store, Bloomberg, learned a whole ton of things about where the data lives, why they were doing it, why we needed to pay attention to it. And from there, really just built all that domain expertise into our platform. And so what I'm seeing today and what they were grappling with back then was everyone's asking me for information around, my green efforts and, we don't want to be perceived as greenwashing. How do we really put credibility behind this? And, the whole idea was, well, let's build software so you can start aggregating that data, presenting that data in a way that people could understand, right? Companies could understand. And so that's really what our goal was, is to help companies be able to identify where that data lived. It was non-financial data. Nobody understood where that data was. So it was really the same kind of exercise we're going through today, except we were focused more on the environmental aspects of things and a little of the social as well, right? Because we all care about, people, right? Because people, planet, and profit. We've been saying that for years. So we always cared about the planet and the people. It was really getting the sustainability folks at the time, it was either CSR or sustainability, into thinking about profit, right? So we were kind of like the feel-good people, but now we were figuring out how do we bring in the profit people so that we can really put teeth around this. And quite frankly, I think that's where we are today. And that's why I'm really excited. And I'm really happy that, I was fortunate enough to get acquired in November 2020 by Navex, part of a bigger family of ethics and compliance, which is a big part of the ESG story. So, really ESG is, we're kind of back where we were. The only difference now is we're bridging the gap between the E, S, and the G. Now we're trying to say, hi, governance folks or legal, let's talk a little bit to the sustainability folks and see what they've been doing all these years, and how do we bring you all together? So that's kind of, it's the same thing. It's the same initiative. I feel like in a way we, for those of us that have been in the industry, we have a lot to share with those that are just coming into the industry looking at ESG. We have a lot of experience, but we don't have a lot of the experience on the G side. So bringing all that together and working with compliance people right now is hugely valuable, because that's going to be really what's going to propel ESG forward. So I hope that was a good explanation, and I'll turn that back over to you, Bob.
Thank you so much. That was terrific.
Sure.
And it makes for a nice transition over to you, Alex, because what Karen described is the evolution and from where she was initially to where we are today. I think companies are having to adapt very quickly to this changing landscape. And when I say adapt, I mean organizationally, they have to figure out how they want to collect data and who does what, who owns what. I know that this was an area that the working group tackled. Can you talk a little bit about the white paper and what it had to say on the topic of ESG ownership?
Yeah, so this was a discussion and a debate that we had within the working group, and I think that the answer that we really came up with was, well, there's really no one size fits all answer to this. There's a number of factors that are at play, and in particular when we're looking at where the ENC function fits in. A lot of it comes down to well, what is the remit of the ENC function with the organization, but also what are the kind of the materiality of that the ESG risk that each company has. It will be different depending on the industry, the activities that every company is involved in. So we made a couple of recommendations in the white paper in terms of how companies can figure out where everybody in the corporate landscape fits in, and what we recommend is really mapping out the roles that those corporate functions play. And when we looked at it, we kind of saw 4 broad categories. So those that are involved in goal setting or goal implementation, and that can be on the overall ESG program or specific to certain risk areas within kind of the ES and G verticals. Those involved in ESG reporting, and then those that may be involved in verification of the data that is going out and is being reported externally. So I think if companies are able to go through this exercise, you can then start to see, well, who fits in and what role does everybody play? And you can then map out your resources. And also from an ENC perspective, you can figure out, well, what is my role as an ENC professional in this ESG landscape? And that's kind of how we saw it, and we thought would be a good start. Either so it may have happened, and so you should go seek that out if it already exists within your organization. But if it hasn't, it's a process that you can go through, and also from an ENC perspective, it's something that would allow you to kind of get a seat at the table for the overall strategy of what you're doing within your company from an ESG perspective.
So that's great. I was just by coincidence talking to somebody today who's in the process of doing mapping exercises for others. So although without referring to the white paper, he was going through the exact type of process that you were describing, Alex. Colin, I'd like to go to you next. And when you're evaluating companies, who are you seeing as the key players here in terms of who owns the E, S, and G and the reporting? I know that you describe these as private companies, and maybe they're at a different level than public companies, but I'd be interested in hearing what you're seeing in the companies that you're evaluating.
Sure. And to be clear, we have private stakes in public companies, and we also have private companies that will one day be public companies, without being too specific. So it's all kind of part of that same ecosystem. It's a good question. For me, there's kind of 2 big dimensions here. There's the substantive progress on these issues, and then there's the transparency and accountability on these issues. Briefly on that first one, the short answer is there's about 1 million people who are doing work on the different substantive areas of ESG, especially depending on the kind of business that you're running. There are perhaps environmental health and safety people who their, worker safety is their primary remit. You perhaps have some of the traditional feel-goodsy, sustainability folks. You might have operational efficiency people who are all they're doing is turning wrenches and trying to improve water, energy, material efficiency. You might have people in the social dimensions who are diversity inclusion experts, human rights people, supply chain, labor issues, you name it. There's a million different specialty functional areas. Those people are all important to me from where I sit as as head of ESG. The best I can be is a triage nurse on that side, diagnose the problem, refer them to the right treatment. But the truth is no one is an expert in all of these different dimensions. And I haven't even gotten to any of the governance dimensions too, where, that's an entirely different set of expertise. So, and there are certain elements of that governance side where the ethics and compliance professionals are a part of that substantive expertise needed. The other side, though, is really kind of, I think, where the crossover happens with ethics and compliance, probably actually more than a lot of people realize on the transparency and accountability side. There are a couple different ways. The first is just the internal accountability mechanisms. When your organization set goals, targets, commitments, they make them in the public sphere, just having the accountability mechanisms in place and reporting mechanisms in place internally to make sure that they get done and to track them, that's something that usually lands in either a compliance bucket or an accounting function, and certainly somewhere in there. A second category that I think is probably under-discussed is the profusion of what I call private governance, which are basically frameworks that are voluntary, perhaps, but are so important in particular fields that you absolutely need to go do them. They may not be regulatory in the sense that they come from a government, but they're kind of pseudo-regulatory or privately regulatory.
Can I just interrupt? Can you give an example?
Absolutely. So Karen undersold herself with her work on conflict minerals, which is, I think, one of the real specialty areas of CSR where they can do a lot of other things well, but that's kind of where their organization started. When you're disclosing your supply chains around those areas, that was, initially, a voluntary framework, but nowadays you wouldn't think to work in that space without it. In our sector for asset managers, it's pretty much a mandatory element at this point to report to the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. That's, again, not a quote unquote required framework, but getting the right responses for it and actually having those responses assured are something that more organizations are doing. Carbon Disclosure Project, there's a bunch of different frameworks out there that are quite common. So I call that the private governance world, where effectively, ethics and compliance professionals need to treat it as if it is a regulatory requirement. And then the third dimension is anything you disclose to your investors. So for a public company, you have a 10K, you have whatever it may be. There's a lot of kind of standard forms of disclosure. As private investors, our LPs are mostly institutional investors, but we're making disclosures to them all the time. And those disclosures, even if they're just text on your annual sustainability report, the SEC takes that very seriously. They think any disclosure you make in a sustainability report about your funds, they consider that a material statement potentially. I can personally vouch for the fact that in a routine SEC, that every several years asset managers have a routine SEC investigation. And the last one that I went through, the SEC staff asked 132 specific questions about ESG statements, disclosures, and commitments that our firm had made. And so that became very much not a problem, but it became something that the legal and compliance functions absolutely were concerned about. And the fact that we'd worked with them for many years to establish paper trails and good audit, trail capability meant that it went a lot better than it could have. But basically all of those things that are related to transparency and disclosure, it is a little bit still of an emerging space, but it's starting to harden in a lot of ways. And that's where the ENC, nexus really is.
All right, fantastic. That's really helpful, Colin. And Karen, you had started out as saying you thought that this is a space where ENC could really be a key driver here. And so this is really an opportunity for you to elaborate on that and on what Colin said about where do you see the ENC professionals really adding value for companies in this ESG space?
Well, I think first of all, when I first started in all this, it was kind of the grassroots. It was always a grassroots effort, right? You had like one person that was championing some kind of environmental initiative or something like that. And it never got the, the credibility or the, they didn't have the teeth, right? I mean, it just didn't have enough to really move things forward. And then it ended up in marketing and CSR, and nobody really knew who owns sustainability. Now with ESG and with, some aspects of regulation coming up now, and the threat of SEC regulation, it is starting to look more and more, and we're starting to see more and more compliance, E&C type of roles taking ownership of ESG, and not just ownership. It could just be that they're a key partner, right? Because ESG is really a cross-functional initiative, right? We're looking at everyone in the organization essentially, right? Because at a high level, you're looking at business risk, you're looking at climate risk, you're looking at human rights, human trafficking, you're looking at marine resource protection, restoration, biodiversity. We've got so many issues under the ESG bucket that it really does require an effort from a lot of different people within a company, right, to disclose the information required. And with the regulations coming in now and it bubbling up to kind of the board level, it just seems, it's making logical sense that it's going to fall under the E&C umbrella, right? We're seeing that more and more. It started with kind of investor relations, we're dabbling with it, but now we're starting to see more of the compliance people, because there are regulations, and we're seeing potentially future regulations as well. So, when you're looking at some of the areas that E&C professionals have already been addressing over the years, it really, it touches upon so many different aspects of their area already. And now it's just a matter of how do we connect the dots with the rest of the organization. So more and more, we're starting to see it fall under the compliance umbrella. At NAVEX Global, our compliance officer owns the ESG initiative and reporting. And it works really well because she can oversee a lot of the data that's required. She can also see, how we might get impacted by upcoming regulation or current regulation. So it makes a lot of sense right now for the compliance folks to have, like I said, either lead it or be a key partner in the ESG efforts.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Just a reminder to those in the audience, if you want to ask a question, please. And the way to ask a question is to, on your Pathable screen, look for the polls tab, click under there, and then you can ask a question. If that's a problem, you can use the chat feature. But either way, we'd love to get your questions, and we will address them on the fly if they fit in. Otherwise, we'll reserve time at the end. Alex, I'd like to go to you and transition to a different theme here, which is, now we have a greater investor focus on these non-financial indicators, which means that companies are under greater, are themselves paying more attention to how they're performing across ESG metrics. That translates into pressure to perform. And that is, let's say, an area where E&C professionals are certainly focused on. We've seen time and time how pressure to meet targets has led to bad compliance outcomes for organizations. And so the question is this something that impacts ESG metrics? And I know this was also an area that the working group touched on. Can you talk a little bit about what the report has to say on that?
Sure, and I think you're right, Bob. From a pressures perspective, E&C professionals, I think we probably all have that, that example in our ABC training of the salesperson facing the pressures and cuts some corners, and therefore, one thing leads to another, and some trouble can occur. But, the kind of what we're doing from an ESG perspective for the reporting, it can succumb to the same pressures, and so we're not immune from that. So I think being aware of those pressures and making sure that people involved in the ESG activities within the organization are live to that is very important. And I think part of that is because we've talked about, and Colin mentioned this, the role that the compliance teams may have in making sure that the accuracy and of the data that's going out is there. It's a lot of this data, if it comes from the CSR space or historically, from some reporting that didn't get exposed to the rigor or the kind of the control process that, say, the financial data did. It may be easier. People may not feel the need to be as accurate or perhaps be a bit loose with kind of the numbers and how it's getting reported. And also, companies are now making quite bold statements about where they're going from an environmental perspective and where they're going to be in 5 years, 10 years, and they may not be thinking about kind of these targets that they've set, and then they have to actually achieve them. And if the numbers over time perhaps aren't leading them down that direction or that path or getting to them to where they said they would be, that pressure can creep in to perhaps move the numbers so they tell a bit of a more positive story. And now that the focus is these disclosures are becoming required, they are being considered in some instances considered material. They're being taken into account by investors and other stakeholders. It really is important that the E&C community is aware of those pressures and when they are, and has a seat at the table to make sure that they are evaluating what is going out the door, the controls are there, and also looking out for any of those potential lapses that they may be looking out for in other parts of the business.
Great. So thank you, and maybe I'll transition to you next, Nikolai. Because at one point in our discussions to prepare for this, you made a comment, and I guess you asked whether it's important to consider why a company is focusing on ESG. Is it focusing on ESG because it's responding to demands from investors, or is it focusing on ESG to meet the broader demands of different stakeholder groups? And could you just talk a little bit about why that makes a difference and how it shows up if a company is really responding to investor demands for ESG performance versus trying to meet broader stakeholder demands?
Sure. And I think this ties directly to the sorts of things Alex was just saying. If you think about what targets might be set or where there might be pressure to perform, different organizations can have different reasons for even working with sustainability information in the first place. But it's really important for them to be clear about what those reasons are so that there's an understanding of the purpose, what might be appropriate targets to set, what are the appropriate pieces of information to track. There's probably a handful of different possible reasons, and this is by no means definitive, but you could imagine that there are some organizations that have engaged with sustainability through the lens of thinking about their supply chain and trying to understand where there might be risks in their supply chain, either environmental or social in nature. And this goes all the way back to even thinking about, some labor condition risks that Nike faced in the 90s. There's other organizations that have approached sustainability through brand building or engagement with customers or employees. And a broad set of stakeholders that may not be providing, making capital allocation decisions, but still have a stake in the organization. And that can be a different set of information, different set of targets that are appropriate. And then there's organizations that might be focused first and foremost on really understanding how sustainability can tie into improving enterprise value, and a lot of what Colin was talking about in terms of the business case for considering and managing these risks and opportunities. And they're not mutually exclusive, and that's not exhaustive, but the reason that it's really important to understand that there are different reasons that an organization might engage with sustainability information is because it changes what might be appropriate targets, or it changes the data that might be most relevant. Because information that's relevant to an investor evaluating risks and opportunities in pharmaceuticals might be things around like affordability, safety of clinical trials, retention of key research staff. And some of those might overlap with the interests and information needs of a customer's employees, but they might also be interested in other issues that aren't as closely tied to material risks and opportunities that investor is focused on. So you end up finding that different audiences have different information needs. And until you can be really crisp about one or more of the audiences you're trying to reach, you're not going to be aware of what might be the right targets. You might not be aware of what pressures you might be facing, or what the right expectations are internally. So I think that purpose and rationale for engaging with sustainability is really important from the get-go.
Sure. Colin, I'd like to bring you in on this because, in some respects, you're kind of at the center of this because you're picking companies based on how they're performing across a variety of metrics, but you're looking specifically at ESG. So how are you seeing this in terms of how are you seeing this pressure manifested today? And what's your thoughts about how that has changed over time?
The pressure is changing, like we're in present tense. It's something I would characterize the pressure as slightly different than performance on ESG. There is a little bit of posturing on ESG that there's a pressure to do, that some of the other speakers have been alluding to. And what I mean by that is it's not like a salesperson that has a particular quota and there's a hard number associated with it. We don't have ESG professionals who they have a carbon reduction, or it's quite rare to have someone say like a carbon production per unit of product goal. But it's quite common to have ESG functions or people who work in marketing functions or sales functions who are making ESG claims and commitments that aren't necessarily justifiable based on their actual practices. And as Alex alluded to, one of the reasons they feel comfortable doing so is that the average person is not thinking of this as subject to the level of scrutiny and legal enforcement as financial disclosures. So, lying about finances, I think we all know that can get you into trouble. Being really fast and loose with ESG claims, there seems to be a little bit more appetite for that, a little bit more kind of comfort for doing that. It doesn't work in the long run, let me tell you. That SEC example I was talking about earlier, one of the things our firm had as commitment was that each one of our portfolio boards would review our ESG policy and confirm compliance every single year. And that was disclosed to our investors. SEC asked us, great, what's your audit trail? Like, do you actually have a record of that being discussed at all of your portfolio companies? Luckily we did, but let me tell you, I don't think a lot of companies necessarily would have had that already in their back pocket. So I think that the fact that people just feel a lot more comfortable being fast and loose with these goals. And there is a pressure to posture in a certain way. I don't think that has evolved to the pressure to perform on particular metrics yet, but I think that in time it will.
Karen, I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in here. What are you seeing, and maybe a little bit about what are you seeing as the solutions that can be offered to help companies manage this pressure and maybe be prepared to, as Colin was referring to, demonstrate that they are performing as they are claiming to be performing.
Sure. Yeah. And, I would be really thoughtful before, I know pressure can lead to, we need to come out with these targets. We need to come out with this information. I think we all, companies have to be really careful with that. I think we have to be really thoughtful, not just kind of willy-nilly, let's just put targets out. Companies need to know that, over time we could get audited here, right? So we want to make sure that whatever companies determine in terms of targets, what their goals are as an organization, that the information's accurate. You can pull that information together. That you have credible information to disclose. Ensure that it's auditable data and make it repeatable, right? We want to make sure this is a repeatable process. This is not a snapshot in time. This is a living, breathing ESG program that needs to continue on a daily basis, right? So this is not going back to the once a year sustainability reporting program, right? We want to make this a living, breathing, environment, right? Because there's so many different aspects that we have to worry about these days. And it's not all negative, and the pressure isn't bad, right? Pressure makes diamonds. So this is a good thing that we're getting a little pressure. We just need to do it right. That's all, right? So, if you're an insurance company, you care about things like, well, you care about sea level rising, right? Because you might have to insure things that are along the coastline. So you have to start thinking about those things. So do I disclose that information? How do I disclose that information? How do I aggregate that data? How do I prepare for climate risk in my organization? How do we, in terms of climate risk, well, that probably relates to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. On the governance side, have we done things like splitting up the CEO and the chairman of the board roles, right? So there are a lot of different things that, we need to make sure that we're not doing things just because we're getting pressure. We're doing it because, first of all, it's the right thing. It's the right thing for your business. And it's something that you can commit to over the years. Because everyone's out there saying net zero by 2050. Some people are saying, reducing reducing emissions by 2030 by 15%. There are a lot of things floating out there right now. And as a company, you got to be really careful, because that's when you get into that whole greenwashing. If you put out loose targets and loose information, people are going to call you on it. They're not going to, think that what you're putting out there in terms of disclosures are credible. So, you never want to lose that, because again, it goes back to your reputational risk. We want to make sure that things are consistent, and you don't just perform based on pressure. You're doing it for to keep your business, transparent, moving forward, and making the progress that we need to make in terms of the environment, your social stuff, as well as your governance. So, all that has to tie together, and it has to be, something that your upper management commits to, your board level commits to, and everyone within the organization buys into. So I think, we have to be really careful on the pressure side of things and just do what's practical and right for your company.
Bob,
Yep, I'm unmuted. I got it. So thank you. I do want to now shift to a topic that we've all touched on, but it's worth digging into. So we've talked about we've used the term materiality, but what exactly does that mean? And I want to turn to you, Nikolai, because the SASB framework provides a framework to decide on what is material in this ESG space. So could you talk a little bit about how you go about, or how the standards say you should go about making a decision as to whether something is material? And is that definition from a SASB perspective the same as the legal definition of material in terms of what needs to be disclosed?
Sure. So there's a couple things there. Let me start with that first point, which is how SASB thinks about materiality, what it means for companies, and then talk about the legal definition overlap. So if you remember what I said earlier, our mission is to improve the availability and comparability of information, and we're focused on investors as the user and decision maker in thinking about this. So what that means practically is we're trying to decide what is decision useful for investors without being too burdensome or costly for companies. That's the balance we have to strike as a standard setter. And so one of the things that we do is look at financial impacts of potential sustainability topics. Can management of water or labor practices or the supply chain or whatever, can management of a particular sustainability issue impact revenue or costs or assets and liabilities or cost of capital? And not every sustainability topic has the same financial impact profile. So if you think about a processed foods company, the health and nutrition profile of their product line can potentially have an impact on demand for products and services. In some, industries, there's a growing demand for products that are seen as healthy or nutritious, and different companies are making different decisions about how to adapt their product lineup accordingly. So the way in which they manage health and nutrition can impact where they're meeting the market demand. If you're a chemicals manufacturer, energy efficiency can be really important to your cost structure because it tends to be very energy intensive to manufacture chemicals. So that's more of an operational efficiency cost structure question rather than demand for products and revenue. So different sustainability topics can have different financial impacts, and we structure our process to really surface that in terms of what we look at. And that's really tied into thinking about materiality, what might have a financial impact. But then how do we ultimately make decisions about what could go in a standard? Because we ultimately say, if you're a chemicals company, these are the sustainability topics and metrics that might be most useful for you as a typical company. If you're an airline, if you're an energy producer, all sorts of different industries have different profiles. So we're not an expert in all those industries. We are an expert at setting up a process to surface the expertise in the market. So we look to companies and consult with them in a variety of ways to say they are expertise in preparing the information, they're experts in knowing their own business, what risks and opportunities do they face. And then we consult and engage with investors who are the users of the information in the context of SASB's work, and say what is useful for them, what do they find is most necessary for making informed investment decisions. And the investors generally want a little bit more information, the companies want to acknowledge a little bit less. And so we find middle ground and compromise decisions to balance those two considerations. When it comes to SASB talking about materiality, SASB uses a definition of materiality that is very traditionally associated with the US Supreme Court definition. We've proposed tweaking that to be a definition that is resonant around the world, but still very much aligned with our historic intent and process. So the words might change, but the intent doesn't. But the thing to remember is that the definition we use to set standards does not mean that the standards are then material for every company in every situation. Materiality is, of course, still the decision of each individual company in evaluating the reasonable investor. And so companies make the decision what's material, but what SASB does is provide an industry framework that allows for kind of a best practice or a template or a framework to benchmark against. And there's plenty of companies out there that report with SASB standards and say, this topic or this metric is not material to our business, and here's why. Energy companies that aren't involved in electricity generation and distribution, just distribution. And so, the energy generation aspect of the SASB standards is not as relevant. And so they don't disclose it. So materiality is still the decision-making of an organization, but SASB's structure is how do we use that thinking to set standards. So I hope that clarifies.
Thank you. Then that would lead naturally to you, Colin, because now you're the user of a framework and you're making materiality decisions. And I guess the question is, there was a time where investors were less focused on these non-financial indicators, right? Now that there is more scrutiny on the E, S, and G than there was historically, does that just mean that the scope of what is material is now broader than what it used to be?
Yeah, well, let me try to rephrase that slightly. These factors were always material, but they wouldn't necessarily have hit the radar screens of investment professionals who weren't thinking about them. The materiality is infinite, right? It's always been true. It's been permanent. But the awareness is perhaps different. I screen our potential investments for ESG risks. I advise them for what to do. But ultimately, the decision making is still done by our investment professionals. I'm just screening things and putting them on their radar that they wouldn't necessarily have understood themselves or necessarily known to look for. I think that's one of the values of SASB, is that it allows that kind of expertise to be spread a little bit more broadly, that people who don't otherwise have a deep expertise in ESG can now have a more accessible, comparable framework to make these decisions. And I actually think expertise is something worth dwelling on for a moment here. Especially in our private markets when we're looking at things, the way that I evaluate companies, quite frankly, is based on my experience and my knowledge of the way that they work and on their material dimensions. I help kind of determine just based on what I know. The more and more that the data is standardized, the more that more companies are reporting it, the easier it will be to make kind of more rigorous structured decisions rather than relying on people who happen to have ESG expertise. So right now in this kind of primordial phase, I think that it's a little bit more discretionary, a bit more subjective, which is not to say that it's not real, but just that it requires a bit more of that. But even once you get to the more rigorous elements of it, I think, we were talking about earlier about pressures and where things could go awry. I think that the issue here are the guardrails. One of those guardrails is the acknowledgement or the general consensus that these issues aren't going to be as legally troublesome as, say, financial disclosures. The other guardrail is expertise. Everyone knows that to do accounting, you need an accountant. To do law, you need a lawyer. But a lot of people are kind of amateur ESG people. As Alex put at the beginning, like, people become ESG experts at the speed of light. That's certainly true of me, by the way. So, I'm sympathetic to it. But it can cause a lot of mistakes made even in good faith, but just out of ignorance of it. And I will give one prominent example that just happened recently, that no less a figure in climate finance than Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and the governor of the Financial Stability Board, who was one of the progenitors of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. He's now on the board of Brookfield, one of our competitors, and he made the claim that their portfolio was carbon neutral on the basis of avoided emissions. That's not at all how carbon neutrality works. Avoided emissions don't count for that. And once he was corrected in public, he immediately obviously said, my apologies, I misspoke. The point I'm trying to make here is not to, savage Mark Carney or Brookfield. They have a lot of excellent programs there, and he's done a lot of excellent work. Just that the nomenclature and the standards related to these issues is something that most people aren't as deeply familiar with as they are with traditional financial accounting. And that means that, if anything, you just kind of have to raise your game one level beyond to make sure that you have the right expertise. If you're doing carbon accounting, by the way, make sure you're using the greenhouse gas protocol from the World Resources Institute. There is already an accounting framework for that. But you have to be very careful in terms of that. So I would just say that for materiality, for carefulness' sake, expertise is invaluable and irreplaceable right now. And really what SASB and others will help us do is make it more accessible to more and more people, to make it less arbitrary and more objective.
All right, so that's quite a challenge for E&C professionals, since they are not the experts in measuring greenhouse gas emissions or anything like that. Alex, this was a topic that the working group tackled. Can you talk a little bit about the white paper's section on this topic of materiality?
Yeah, so when we addressed materiality in the white paper, what we were really looking at is the importance of carrying out that materiality risk assessment, or that materiality assessment of the ESG risks. And as we set out, in the white paper, there's dozens of topics or issues, that fall into those E, S, and G verticals, and they not all apply to every company. And so, in order to determine where the resources, the finite resources that exist within an organization, need to be deployed, it's really important that assessment is taken place, that assessment takes place, so the company can figure out what is most important for it, but also what's most important for its investors and its other stakeholders, and what do they care about, and so it can really have a steer and notice and determine where they need to deploy those resources, those finite resources that they have. In some organizations, this may have already taken place, so E&C professionals may find that they are just feeding into the process. So they, they understand where they are in line in terms of the importance of the areas that they're doing, and so they just then feed in and they provide the information. But there's a number of companies that just haven't started this, or they're doing it, they're refreshing it. And we do think that there's a real role here for the E&C professionals, often because it's the E&C teams that have those relationships across the organization. They have those networks, and these ESG topics really, as we've discussed, they cover everything, and they really do cut straight across an organization. So those networks that the E&C professionals have are really important. And also those E&C professionals have been through risk assessments before. You know, a common example of it would be an ABC risk assessment. And so being able to lend that experience to the process is very important. And we think it's a way that E&C teams can get a seat at the table and really contribute to this activity.
Great. So, Karen, again, just focusing on the subject of materiality, any thoughts about how E&C professionals can add value in helping their companies decide what is material and keeping track of that, and making sure that disclosures in those areas of what is material are robust?
Sure. Well, I think we talked about, every company is a little different. But, consumers, investors, right, we want to see businesses that are ethical, right? We want to see ethical companies doing the right thing, and they're disclosing disclosing as much information as possible just to create that transparency. And with E&C right now, you're already looking at regulations. We've got regulators like the DOJ and the SEC. They're getting very savvy around this topic, right? They're looking at it very deeply now. They're looking at how it impacts risk. And, it's gone way beyond the whole, feel good environmental sustainability, CSR glossy reports, right? So we really have to, we do have to bump up our game a little bit, right? So there is expertise that's required here. You want to understand, what it is that you want to disclose, what is material to your company. A lot of times I'll reference the SASB materiality map, just as an exercise to maybe start with, till you understand what is material to your organization. And then you have to decide what you're going to disclose, right? So the more you disclose, the better off you'll be, but don't just disclose, make sure it's accurate, make sure you can back it up, make sure, again, I always go back to make sure everything's auditable, just like any other compliance program, any other regulatory program, it has to be auditable. And not to plug NAVEX ESG, which was CSR where now relabeled as NAVEX ESG, but that's something that we help you navigate, right? So by bringing in these frameworks, the SASB or the Global Reporting Initiative, and we probably haven't talked enough about the social side and the governance, but a lot of these frameworks in SASB, Global Reporting Initiative, they incorporate the E, the S, and the G metrics, right? So then you can determine what's material to you. And then like within a platform like a NAVEX ESG, you don't have to worry about the burdensome part of how do I calculate my greenhouse gas emissions? We're going to automate that process for you, right? So some of the software tools that are out there in the industry today can help you facilitate this whole process. Once you've identified what's material to you, you can leverage this, like our technology platform to aggregate all that data, put it in a central repository, ensuring that it's all auditable, being able to assess it through dashboard analytics, and then ultimately just aligning it with your business strategy. And that way, if you are audited or you are questioned by anyone, you'll have that confidence to go back and generate reports that are required to back up the information that you've released to the public domain. And I don't want to, lose sight of, human rights and, worker wellness, and all aspects of the social metrics as well. We're incorporating all of that into the ESG programs. We do talk a lot about the environmental component to ESG sometimes, only because it's been around for a long time and it's a little bit easier to capture because a lot of it's quantitative data. When you've got social data, a lot of it's been qualitative, it's been subjective, it's been a little harder to measure. But with SASB and GRI and other frameworks that are coming together, or that are already out there, they've established ways to help us quantify it a little bit better so that we can start measuring those metrics just as effectively. So, we just need to think about, how we're bringing all this in together. And, another plug is, that's why our platform, there's value there, right? Is just because it's all centralized, you can see the data, you can make better decisions, and ultimately, it'll represent what is material to your business. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Bob. And just wanted to kind of interject that tools can make this a little bit of an easier process.
Great. And I know that SASB also offers guidance on how to prepare disclosures and ensure data reliability. And Nicola, maybe you could speak briefly to that, but then if you could also transition to a description of the SASB conceptual framework and describe what the 5 primary sustainability dimensions are, because I'd like to, in the time we have, so we're going to go fast here, I'd like to be able to see where ENC professionals, or give the visual for ENC professionals to see where their work fits in. But very briefly, if you could start with the guidance that SASB has on preparing disclosures and ensuring data reliability.
Sure. One thing, just directly building off what Karen said, is that technology can definitely just help accelerate the credibility, the traceability, the reliability of all this information. So I think that's extremely valuable for organizations to look at, like Navex Global, as a resource. And so it really speaks to this idea that the main consideration for guidance on how to prepare sustainability disclosures is that companies already have the skills to collect data, review internally, and disclose publicly. It's applying those skills and processes from financial information and other information that's currently considered to sustainability information. And so we have 2 resources that you can download. One is an implementation primer, which is a step-by-step overview. If you're starting at square one, it talks about performing a gap analysis, considering disclosure location, ensuring information is reliable, all of those things. We also then have something that's called the standards application guidance, which says if you're using a standard for disclosure, how do you handle the fact that you might cover multiple industries with various business units? How do you think about the use of estimations? What considerations should you make if it's appropriate to change or omit a metric entirely? And so how do you think about strategy, targets, risk management? It's just a few pages and really talks about, applying the standards and disclosures. So that guidance, I think, can help organizations wrap their minds around what does it mean to use our existing disclosure and data collection skills in the context of sustainability. And any number of people can be and are involved. I know there was a question in the chat around should ENC professionals take the lead. I think it's going to depend on the organization. It's going to depend on their purpose for thinking about sustainability, which I mentioned before, and it's going to depend on where the skills and current management of risks and opportunities sits within an organization. And it may be ENC, it may be others, and it's inevitably going to involve, kind of multi-functional collaboration, and usually a committee of folks. So you also asked really briefly to talk about the conceptual framework and the scope of information that SASB has. So this gets into another question in the comments around, primarily we've been talking about environmental issues. Let me briefly show what is in the scope of SASB's work, just to make this feel a little bit more alive. So we've got environmental issues, but we also look at social capital, customer privacy, data security, affordability, human capital like employee health and safety, engagement, diversity and inclusion, business model issues, and leadership and governance, which you can kind of think as like governance with a little lowercase g, operational governance rather than board governance type issues like critical incident risk management or supply chain management or product design. And so these things are going to vary by industry. If you look at a hardware industry, social issues related to product security, employee diversity and inclusion, and human capital, which is going to be different than a chemicals company, a lot more environmental potential issues there, which is different than an automobile industry. And I'm just racing through these because of the limited time, but it gives you a sense, and all of this can be seen on the SASB website, but it gives you hopefully a sense of how the range of sustainability issues that we started with in the beginning ultimately filter out to just a handful of issues that tend to be relevant within a particular industry. And so hopefully that guidance between the standards themselves and then the other 2 resources that I mentioned can be useful in bringing up the level of expertise, as Colin mentioned.
Actually, would you mind, Nikolai, just going back to your first shared screen? And I'd like to keep it on the screen while Colin is answering a question. So I know that you talked about expertise, and the more companies you see, the more you know what's material, but how are you deciding which of these areas is important for a particular investment? You're looking at a potential investment opportunity in a particular sector. How are you deciding which of these shaded areas are the most important?
So obviously SASB has done a lot of the work for us because of all the stakeholder engagement that they've done over the years with the customers in a particular sector, the producer, every potential stakeholder in a sector gives us an idea of what that is right off the bat. Other than that, yeah, the dozens or hundreds of deals that I've worked on in my years in private equity ESG, you see a lot. We also work with third-party experts when we do so. Either the big four accounting firms all have sustainability practices. There's a couple of other major firms like ERM that do a lot in this field. Quite frankly, it actually becomes quite obvious at a certain point, especially because if you talk to the deal professionals on a particular deal, they know their businesses quite well. They might not understand each issue as ESG, but they would understand how each ESG issue affects them. So if they run an industrials business, they already know that health and safety is a material financial issue for them. And so honestly, it usually comes together quite nicely once you really dig into it, if you have access to expertise. SASB, of course, is, as I said, a great leveler if you don't have the money to go out and engage major consulting firms to help you do this materiality analysis.
Great. And Karen, let me go to you next. A lot of the work that E&C professionals do, they're focusing on risk management, compliance risk management, and building cultures of compliance. And when you look at this map, the SASB map, where do you see E&C fitting in?
Well, I think they fit into a couple of the buckets, right? So probably under leadership and governance, there's a lot of areas under there, right? That probably makes the most sense. And some aspect of human capital, right? I mean, I think, the social and human capital side of things, I think will probably bridge human resources, compliance. Yeah, probably those departments. You've got product quality and safety. So, yeah, I would say probably those categories make the most sense. But also incorporating some aspect of, supply chain oversight as well, right? Because we want to make sure there are no risks associated with doing business with certain types of suppliers that may have really poor, human rights issues going on, or poor factory conditions, those kinds of things. But I would probably stick more with the leadership and governance aspect, because I think that probably aligns nicely with some of the work that's been done in the past. But again, the social and human capital, all that can't be kind of a separate entity, right? It all has to be kind of integrated under all this, because there are going to be more regulations around some aspect of, how we're managing human capital, or how we're looking at human capital. And, as there's more compliance and regulation around it, again, it makes sense for that to be under the compliance umbrella. So we're watching that as part of our reputational risk, as part of potential legal fines, those kinds of things that already fall under the E&C bucket.
Great. And Alex, wanted to go to you next, and in particular, we just heard Karen look at the supply chain management, and I guess this was also an area that the working group focused on in terms of, an area that E&C has some expertise on. Could you just talk a little bit about what the, I guess, conclusions were of the working group in that space?
Sure. Just I'd also add, just to kind of tail on what Karen was saying, I do see there's just kind of a layer of ethics that sits all over across all of this, of course, in terms of deciding how do we pitch what we're reporting, or the story we're trying to tell, and making sure that you're kind of not taking kind of an unethical slant to perhaps the and it's that whole greenwashing bit, I think, that one needs to be thinking about. So I think there is a layer of ethics that just sits all over across all of this. But if we look specifically at the kind of that supply chain management piece, we did call this out specifically in the working paper. or the white paper, for the reasons that we see this as an area where E&C is already established and can really add some additional value. For most E&C programs will have some sort of third-party management program for some of their higher risk business partners. Either driven by anti-bribery and corruption requirements, trade sanctions, AML, for example, and because that is already there, E&C professionals can either help those other areas that are now being exposed to some of this reporting requirements or these screening requirements, be it on the human rights side or the environmental side when they're looking at supply chain. So either provide advice, guidance, or in fact, kind of expand the scope of the systems and procedures that they already have in place to kind of take in, these other risk areas. So there's more of a holistic approach, throughout the organization. That way, again, being that strategic partner, having a seat at the table, helping their companies make the right decisions and be as efficient as possible when it comes to dealing with this wide variety of ESG challenges.
Great, and if I could go back to Nikolai, under leadership and governance, you have business ethics. Could you just elaborate what is the guidance in terms of what is measured there?
Muted. Nearly made it the whole time. So, I can't share screen, unmute, and talk all at the same time. I can only have so many tricks up my sleeve. So business ethics, as it manifests in the SASB standards and often in sustainability discussions generally, tends to surface often very closely with competitive behavior. Sometimes there's a lot of overlap where it's really speaking to how is an organization thinking about either potential conflicts of interest. If you are let's see, trying to recall all 77 industries can be a challenge, but I can remember one, like if you're a securities exchange, which is not going to be very many organizations, but plenty of other organizations have conflict of interest potential. But those organizations in particular are designated self-regulatory environments. They're both trying to seek the business of companies to be listed, and then also trying to provide a forum for investors to have confidence in allocating capital. There's a lot of management of potential conflicts of interest there. There's other industries as well. I just don't have all of the details on top of my head. But that's often where some of the instances where business ethics can come in. Similarly, it can come in if you are a mining company or an extractives company operating in countries or regions that don't have as robust anti-corruption policies, but you rely on government grants or government contracts to either access resources, or this is also common in the aerospace industry, where there has been a rash of challenges over the years around business ethics related to corruption and bribery. So those tend to be some of the issues that manifest. They're not relevant to every industry, but certain industries, by the nature of their business model, they are exposed to the potential conflicts of interest or corruption and bribery issues that might emerge in those related topics.
I know that we only have a few minutes left, and this does get to one of the questions that we got. We're struggling to come up with meaningful metrics in the ethics and compliance space to contribute to our ESG reporting. And this last comment that you just talked about on business ethics highlights, I guess, this area. What are the right metrics? And I guess what I would just add is that the ethics compliance professional community spends a lot of time thinking about what what their measures are and what's measurable and what's not measurable. And I don't know, maybe can be a voice going forward for ways to improve what the standards are, or what the structure of reporting and standards should be in a space such as business ethics, which are within the leadership and governance. But I think also, as we can see, as people see this, SASB brought 5 dimensions chart, you see where ethics and compliance can have responsibility in all of them. I think we have time for maybe just one other question. Let me just see quickly. So another question is, there are concerns that are focused on, anyone want to take the question on whether or not the focus on sustainability, which requires often cooperation among companies, often competitors, what the particular challenges are there? And I don't know if anyone wants to
I'm
take
happy
that one.
to.
Go
just
ahead.
because we obviously invest in a lot of different companies and we have a portfolio of them. Very briefly, I think this is an academically interesting question, but I have not heard anyone in my space ever think of it as necessarily a present day concern. But more importantly, I think that right now we might be, since the space is relatively immature, we might be in a quote unquote pre-competitive phase. I guarantee you that once it becomes a point of driving stock prices and profit margins, that it will become a hyper competitive field and you'll see a lot less cooperation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
Just to say, Bob,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Karen.
Alex.
I was just going to say that I am aware that there's various discussions and publications that have been out there, in particular on this side of the pond in Europe, and I think one of the issues is the regulations were written before this was ever around, or the whole idea of coordinating and cooperating for the greater good of the planet and our overall welfare. So I think it's being looked at least from what I can see, and I do think it's an issue that needs to be addressed, because when we're all trying to achieve, we're all trying to kind of get to the same goal, and this is all for the greater good, that we need to perhaps take a sensible approach on these things. But again, that's down to the regulators.
And Karen, I think I'm going to give you the last word.
I was just going to add that in the sustainability space for all these years, it's been very cooperative, right? We've all worked together. Think about the SASB standards. They came together because it was a bunch of different working groups from a lot of different industries, a lot of companies, a lot from the sustainability space. As a matter of fact, Nicole, we should probably make sure that we're getting the E&C folks into the SASB working groups, right? Moving forward, that would be great, because then the compliance folks can start influencing what's going on with SASB standards. Because in the past, it really has been CSR and sustainability, and there hasn't been any competitive. It has been an interesting field because we haven't really dealt with the competitive nature of things, because everybody's about transparency, right, and making sure we're disclosing everything. But I think with ESG, it does add a little wrinkle there, right? So it's something we're going to need to watch. But I would love to see the E&C professionals start engaging with SASB and really starting to influence some of the standards that we've all been working on for many years now. So I'll just leave it with that, and hopefully we can get some participation there.
I can't think of a better way to close this out than the prospect of an open door for further collaboration among E&C professionals and SASB. Yes. and other standard organizations. Alex, Colin, Karen, Nikolai, thank you very much. I hope for all of you in the audience, you found this discussion as interesting and enlightening as I did. We really had a variety of voices, and I think they all contributed to our understanding of this topic. So thank you again, everyone. And for those of you from the ECI community, I hope to see you at the Impact Conference coming up. And thank you again, and hope everyone has a great evening and afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, too. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.